One important thing I want to say before we start and before I present Professor Gene Grossman is that he asked me to say to you all that he would like to be interrupted during the presentation. So please feel free at any time if you want to make questions, because this is the main purpose of the presentation, that he gets some inputs from the students. We have undergraduate students from economics, we have undergraduate students from law, social sciences, mathematics. So it's a very good opportunity for him to hear from you any type of question, not only related to the paper, but at the end of the session, all questions related to international trade. Professor Grossman has a very well-known paper about the NAFTA agreement in 1994, so you may also address questions to him about that and other questions as well. So having said that, let me make a presentation. Professor Grossman actually does not need presentation, but just for those of you who do not know him, he is the Jacob Weiner Professor of International Economics at Princeton University, Chair of Princeton's Economics Department, not anymore, he got rid of that, and the Director of the International Economics Section. He received his BA in Economics from Yale University in 1976 and his PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1980. Professor Grossman joined the faculty of Princeton University in 1980 as well, and holds a joint appointment in the Department of Economics and the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He has a very well-known book with Elhanan Helpman, which we use here in our graduate course in economics, the first year, called Innovation and Growth in the Global Economy. And he also serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Economic Growth, the Review of International Economics, the European Journal of Political Economy, and the German Economic Review. So please, let's welcome Professor Grossman. Thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's my third time to Rio, and it's certainly one of the most beautiful cities in the world, so I'm only sorry that it's only my third time. I understand that this is a very diverse audience, which makes my job a little more challenging. I'm afraid that this is a rather technical paper. However, I want to try my best to make it accessible to everybody. So some of the details might be a little challenging for those who have not studied graduate economics, but I hope at least the main ideas to get across to everybody. And as you see on this slide, we always like to acknowledge our co-authors. I've been working with Elhanan Helpman for going on 30 years now. We like to say we're the oldest and happiest marriage in the economics profession. And Philip Kircher is a new author on this project, at least new for us. So this paper asks a very familiar age-old question, which is how does trade or how does globalization affect the income distribution? It's already 75 years since Stolper and Samuelson wrote a very famous paper in 1941 addressing very much the same question I'm going to address today. And so you might ask, so why revisit something that's been so much studied and fairly well understood? Well, until now, largely for reasons to do with data, when we ask this question of how trade affects the income distribution, we tended to look at a small number of aggregate factors. We might distinguish between workers who work in different industries, or more typically workers at different skill levels or in different occupations. The famous Stolper-Samuelson theorem, of which I'll refer to today, is a result explaining how trade affects income distributed between two different factors of production, all of whom are within each factor are similar or homogeneous. So there might be skilled workers and unskilled workers, or there might be workers and capitalists, but workers are considered to be the same. Capitalists or skilled workers considered to be the same. But in fact, we have a lot better data now, and one of the richest data sets by sheer coincidence that we use in this paper to motivate concerns Brazil. So I'll show you those numbers in a moment. But they tell us that this simple story dividing factors into two types, skilled and unskilled, or maybe workers in the import industry versus the export industry, misses a lot of the story, misses in fact most of the story. That most of the story of trade's effect on income distribution is within occupations and within industries, affecting the distribution between those who are working side by side in some sense, more so than the effect on those between different industries, working in different industries or engaged in entirely different occupations. So this is, as I say, a technical paper, an economic model, theoretical model that tries to allow us to think about how trade affects a richer and more heterogeneous view of the workers in the labor force. So let me start off by telling you the story that the model is going to tell, and if the details swamp you, at least these takeaways you'll have today. So the starting point, as I say, is that factors of production, I'm going to call them two types of factors. I'm going to call them workers and managers. But within each of those categories, we have very heterogeneous individuals, very different from each other, different abilities, different skill levels. We're going to think about the combinations of those factors. So workers are going to, of course, work together with managers. Managers are going to manage a team of workers in this model. The combinations matter for productivity. So, of course, a better or more skilled worker is more productive than a less skilled worker. A more skilled manager is more productive than a less skilled manager. That's fairly obvious. But the new element we want to emphasize here is that the teams matter. That a better worker, although always more skilled than a less talented worker, is especially productive when paired together with a talented manager. So that the team, the formation, the combinations in the team are important for productivity. What the model tells us is that there are economic incentives for the different site types to sort to different industries. I'm going to talk about a model with two industries, an industry that competes with imports and an industry that exports. And we're going to see systematically that certain types of workers distinguished by their ability will sort to one industry or the other. When they get there, they're going to be paired by firms together with managers. So the managers are going to sort to the industries, the workers are going to sort to the industry, and they're going to form teams within each industry. The identity of who sorts to an industry, of course, determines who can pair together once they get there. So the formation of those production teams is important for productivity. And as we'll see, the bottom line is, as trade affects the teams that form, it affects the within industry and occupation income distribution. So the nature of those combinations determines who wins and loses from international trade. For those of you who have studied some trade, our starting point is perhaps the workhorse model of international economics, developed by two Swedish economists, Heckscher and Ohlin. Heckscher-Ohlin model is a model with, as I said before, two industries and two factors of production. and our starting point is going to be exactly the same. The only departure, but it's a substantial one that makes the work a lot more difficult, the departure is that within each of these categories we have many different types, many different ability levels of workers, and many different ability levels of managers. So as you can see in the bullet point here, if my clicker goes, we're going to talk about managers who are going to be identified with a QH, Q for ability, H for manager. I know H doesn't stand for manager, it comes from high skilled, if you will. And QL will be the different types of workers, Q for the quality, L for the labor or the worker. But let me show you some motivating evidence, as I said, drawn from the Brazilian data. So Brazil is one of the small number of countries that has a very good data set matching together employers and employees. So we know which firm the workers are working. We know features of the firm and features of the worker. This is an excellent data set for studying the labor market. We just scratched the surface of this very deep and detailed data set. We take data from 2 years, 1986 and 1994. Why those years? Well, you probably, many of you, or some of you know better than I do, that these years span a major trade reform. The trade reform in 1991 was the major economic event in Brazil in that period. And so, loosely speaking, we can think of this as before trade reform and after trade reform, and the changes we can think about as being largely due to trade liberalization. In this paper, we just take a very broad brush. My co-author, Helpman, has worked with these data at a much more detailed level before, but I'm just going to show you some figures that divide the economy into 12 tradable industries and 2 occupations. Why 2 occupations? Because that's the way the model is going to be structured. And since the model talks about workers and managers, I'm going to divide the Brazilian data into exactly those categories. Now let me show you 4 features of the data. So in this graph, on the vertical axis, you see the log of the average income level for managers in an industry, and along the horizontal axis, the log of the average income for workers in an industry. And you see for the 12 industries, 12 numbers representing them. In the paper, there is a list that identifies them. Here they're just data points, if you will. And the striking feature that you see is that the industries that attract the high-paid workers also attract the high-paid managers. So that we have a very positive correlation between the pay to the workers, average pay to the workers in industry, and the average pay to the managers in the industry. When I get to the details of the model, we're going to see that there's 2 different possible outcomes that could come out here. Either the best workers could sort to the same industry as the worst managers, and the worst workers could sort to the same industry as the best managers, or the best workers can sort to the same industry as the best managers, and the worst could sort to the same as the worst. What this figure is telling you is that when we get to it, we should pay more attention to the latter case because that seems to be what's happening in the data. The best are sorting together with the best. This is probably the most important motivating observation, and it supports my point that I said that most of the action in income distribution is within industry and occupation. So let's just spend a couple of minutes with this chart. So on the top, we distinguish workers and managers, and these figures refer to workers, these figures refer to managers. We decompose inequality in the industry, which has an index here. The units are not that important. It's the composition that is the point I want to make. Inequality can come about because workers in different industries get paid different amounts, or because workers in the same industry get paid different amounts. So that corresponds to within the industry is the workers in the same industry, and between the industries is workers across industries, across these 12 industries that you saw on the previous slide. And what you can see is in 1986, most of the inequality in Brazilian wages took place among workers working in the same industry. The differences across industries were much less important to overall inequality. And the same was true in 1994, and the same was true for managers in 1986, and the same was true for managers in 1994. Within industry dominates across industry in understanding, or not understanding, but in just measuring income inequality. And then this column change is the change before and after the trade that occurred during the period of the trade liberalization. You could see that worker inequality went up in this period by 0.045 units. Again, was that because workers in different industries were affected differently, or because different workers in the same industry were affected differently? Well, you can see that most of it was within the industry and relatively little across industries. And similarly for managers. So all of our economic theories of linking trade to income distribution have focused on this row, and my claim is the action is up here. We need a model that allows us to think about different workers working in the same occupation and the same industry being affected differently. Down here, we lump the two occupations together, so we have workers and managers together, and now we have variation that's within occupation and industry, so that's within the category of workers or managers for the same industry, or across, and again, the action is largely within industries and less so between industries. So you might think that with only 2 occupations and 12 industries, we haven't really allowed for enough richness in the categorization. Well, in Helpman's other paper with several co-authors, they have 300 industries and 200 occupations. So there are 60,000 cells. You would think maybe that everybody in the same cell gets paid roughly the same. In fact, half of the inequality in the Brazilian labor force is within those 60,000 narrow cells, and only half of it is looking across the cells. And again, the change from this period from 86 to 94, half of the change is within those very narrow cells. So we have to think about a richer view of the labor market than just several occupations and several industries. Our model is going to imply that the effects of trade liberalization on workers within an industry are in the opposite direction typically than the effect on managers in the same industry. So we'd like to see a negative correlation between what happens to the inequality among managers and what happens to the inequality among workers. Here's the change for these 12 industries. There is a negative correlation, not the strongest, tightest relationship statistically that you and I have ever seen, but at least the prediction in the model is broadly borne out. A little more convincing is this next figure. Our model will also predict that these changes in inequality ought to be linked with how much the price changes as a result in the industry as a result of trade liberalization. So here we see the change in price between 86 and 94 and the change in inequality in the industry. The model predicts that it ought to be positive for one factor and negative for the other. And you can see that that works out a little better. There does seem to be a very systematic relationship between what's happening to prices in Brazil and what's happening to the within industry and within occupation inequality among the workers and among the managers. Okay, so that's sort of the challenge of this paper, is to explain that. And as I say, the story we're going to tell is in the forming of new and changed teams of workers and managers within industry that affects their income. Okay, for those who haven't studied a lot of economics, now's the time to hold your breath. And I apologize, had I known the composition of the audience, I might have generated a different talk, but we'll try to get through this together. So as I said, this is a model with two industries. Not very imaginatively, I'm going to call them Industry 1 and Industry 2. One will be an export industry, the other will compete with imports in the trade equilibrium. And there are going to be two factors of production, and I said I'm going to call them labor and managers. The distinction is that these workers are not all the same as each other, and these managers are not all the same as each other. I'm going to index them by their ability or their skill level or their talent or their quality as workers, whatever word that you like, so that there are L bar times phi L of QL workers with ability QL. So there's going to be a distribution across all these different types, and this will tell us how many of each of the different types we have in the economy. And this is the key production relationship that we're going to use here. So this is in industry I, that is to say either in Industry 1 or Industry 2. The output that a manager manages to produce when he works together with L workers, and when those workers are ability QL, and he or she, himself or herself, is ability QH, is given by this expression here. So I'll explain it in more detail. I'm going to step away from the microphone if that doesn't mess anything up, because I like to point a little more closely. So this would be the Hector-Oline model. If there were no differences in the workers and managers, we would have output related to how many workers work per manager. One industry would be relatively intensive in the use of workers, having less diminishing returns when we add more workers to the production process. The other relatively uses more managers. That's the basic Hector-Oline story of trade. A country with a lot of workers compared to skilled workers, unskilled compared to skilled workers. Then China is going to export goods at use, unskilled workers, and import goods at use. The more skilled workers, or in this case managers. So that effect is here. Different industries vary in how productively they use numbers of workers per manager. The new element is here. The productivity of any production team, given the quantities, given how many workers there are, depends upon how good the manager is and how good the workers are. And of course, having a good manager makes productivity go up. Okay, and so a better QH makes for more output. A better QL makes for more output. But we're also going to assume that the combinations matter and that the extra output you get from a higher QH is especially high if the workers are good and vice versa. So that you want to form teams that combine good workers with good managers. That's the best way to generate productivity. In relatively simple English, I guess it's not the simplest English word, but simpler word, what we assume is that there's complementarity between the ability of the worker and the ability of a manager in generating productivity. In a more technical mathematical term, we assume that this function here is something that's called log supermodular. If you know what that means, that helps, and if you don't worry about it. Okay, well, I'm not going to show you all or even very much of the algebra, but I'll just show you one expression here. So the firm maximizes profits. Profits here are the price in industry I times the output. So this whole thing here is revenue. This output is exactly the output that I showed you on the previous slide. So that's revenue minus the labor cost. So here's the wage. The new feature here, of course, is if you want good workers, you have to pay for them. So the wage will depend upon the ability of the workers, which will be determined in the economic equilibrium, and the number of workers you hire per manager. So this is the wage bill per manager, and then R is the manager's salary, which also depends upon the ability of the manager. Yes, question?
All the workers in a given firm are of the same queue?
We don't assume that. We prove that that will be the case. I'm skipping a few steps here. So not by assumption, but yes, by implication.
If they are different, the QL is what? The average queue?
No, the QL, the manager divides his time between the workers in proportion to how many there are, and then you just add up how much the worker works with each, how much each sub-team produces, if you will. Okay. Okay, so we have to maximize profits. This is a standard problem in any intermediate micro tasks. We usually think about choosing how many workers to hire, and the condition we use is that the marginal product of the last worker should equal the wage. That's still true here, but there's an additional feature, which is that we have to choose which type to hire, not just how many. As I just answered to the question, we start with allowing the firm to choose as many different types as it wants. Each firm is given its manager is going to prefer to choose some optimal type, and the optimal type is determined by the one that maximizes the firm's profits. Okay, so you write down those first order conditions, that optimization, and you get this expression here, which I'm going to try to talk you through because it's crucial to the understanding how the sorting works. So epsilon will always refer to an elasticity.
Maybe I anticipate a bit the result, just to make it clear. Different types of
manager, if you have two firms with different managers, with managers of the same quality, they will end up hiring the same type of workers in the same quantity as well, or?
If they're in the same industry, yes.
Okay.
They have the same problem. Yeah, maybe I should have said, or I will say now, this is a competitive economy. The technology is available to everybody, so there are no better firms and worse firms. Any firm can hire any manager it wants. It becomes a, quote, good firm by hiring a talented manager. Of course, that's the good news. The bad news is it has to pay for him or her. And you can hire then workers, but since they all have the same technology, they have the same problem. They'll make the same choices. In different industries, or if they have different managers, they will make different choices.
In management, you consider the ratio between managers and workers. Did you also have a factor in your formula for this? Because there's a ratio on optimizing managers versus workers.
Yes, so that's what L is already, is workers per manager.
Oh, okay.
Or the opposite of managers per worker, yes. So this is the profits that the firm earns per manager. Since there's constant returns to scale, multiply it by the number of managers, and you get the profits that the firm earns from all its managers of this ability. And if it has managers of different abilities, it'll earn that much more profits. At the end of the day, because it's a competitive model, the firms don't earn any profits. The firms have zero profits. Everything gets paid to the managers and the workers. Okay, so epsilon is an elasticity. So epsilon IL is an elasticity that tells us how much productivity in industry I goes up in percentage terms as we increase the ability of the workers. So it's the benefit you get from ability in the industry from raising quality. And evidently, this can differ in different industries. The ability of the workers can be more important in rocket science than in textiles industry. And so in that example, the epsilon for rocket science would be higher. The abilities would matter more than it would in the textile industry. And downstairs here is the elasticity. It's this gamma that you saw here, but that turns out also to be the elasticity of output with respect to numbers. It's how much output goes up in percentage terms as we increase proportionally the number of workers holding fixed their quantity. And what this optimality formula is telling the firms to do is go out there and look in the marketplace on how wages go up with ability, the elasticity of wages with respect to ability, and set equal to that elasticity, choose their workers so that this ratio is equal to that elasticity. In other words, firms in this world have two ways to increase output. So firms in a familiar microeconomic context have one way to increase output. They hire more workers. Here we can hire more workers, or we can hire better workers. And if we want to increase output on the margin, we want to find the optimal way of doing that. You want to tilt towards better workers if output is very responsive to quality of workers and less responsive to numbers, and you want to tilt towards more workers if output's more responsive to numbers than to quality. And in that latter case, if you're going to go for a lot of guys, you might as well conserve, or you better conserve on the wage bill. You might better choose a lot of less expensive workers in order to maximize profits. So comparing across the two industries, the industry that has the higher ratio of the importance of ability compared to the importance of quantity is the one that's going to go for the best workers. And the industry that has the lower ratio is the one that's going to go for the larger number of less talented workers. Let me show you a figure, skip a few slides and show you this figure here. So the two curves here, sorry, I'm going to flip back. The two curves here are going to plot this ratio for industry 1 and this industry for industry 2. One of them is going to be in blue and one of them is going to be in red. And at the end of the day, these ratios are going to be equal because of the optimization to how wages go up for the workers. So the blue curve is the one with the higher ratio of the elasticity with respect to ability compared to the elasticity with respect to quality. To numbers. And I already said that it makes sense intuitively that that's the industry that ought to go for the good workers. That's the rocket science industry, if you will. And the other industry, the red industry, is the industry where numbers are more important, relatively speaking, compared to ability. And since the wage schedule is going to have the elasticity equal to this ratio, you can see what the workers are going to want to do. These workers can get paid this amount if they work in the blue industry, but because they're not as extra productive in the red industry, the firms there would only be willing to pay the dotted red amount. And so all those workers prefer to go to the blue industry than the red industry. Then there'll be some worker here with disability who's just indifferent to get paid the same amount in either industry. And then these guys actually could be paid more in the red industry than in the blue industry. Why? Because the red industry wants to hire large numbers of them and will have greater demand for having large numbers of relatively unskilled workers. Okay, so at the end of the day, everybody's going to go where they get paid the most. You've probably figured that out by now. And so what we have is a simple equilibrium here with what we call sorting, where the best workers sort to the blue industry and the least skilled workers, the least talented workers, sort to the red industry. Yes.
Or is always that way to connect fats?
It is not always this way. You've seen the paper, so we do have a picture with blue, red, and blue again in there. We give conditions where it's going to come out this way, but it doesn't necessarily have to come out this way. That's true. The picture illustrates, and I'm going to use this word, something that we call a threshold equilibrium. A threshold equilibrium, the word means that all the workers from the top to some threshold sort to one industry, and all the workers from that threshold down to the bottom sort to the other industry. So that's what you see in the picture. If there were 3 zones, it would not be a threshold equilibrium. If it's a threshold equilibrium, again, there can be 2 different types. So we'll refer to an HHLL equilibrium as an equilibrium where the best types of workers, the high types, and the best types of managers, also the high types, sort to the same industry, and the worst types of the workers and the worst types of the managers sort to the other industry. And HLLH is the opposite. This is a case where the best workers sort to the same industry as the worst managers, and vice versa. And at this stage of abstraction, without assuming anything more, we can get either of these outcomes. Now, as we've already seen from the figure I showed you at the beginning, from an abstract theoretical point of view, either of these is equally good, but from an empirical relevance point of view, this is, at least in the Brazilian case, much more compelling than this, because we saw that strong positive correlation between the pay to workers in industry and the pay to the managers in the same industry. So although it's just our bad luck that this case is a little bit easier to analyze, and in order to explain to you some of the intuition, I'm going to start with this, but eventually we're going to want to get here because that's the more empirically relevant case. Yes?
So is there any reason to expect that these equilibria are going to be robust in the sense that you wouldn't have HH before the structural change and HL and a microphone after the shock? Or, I mean, when you do the comparative statics,
Yes.
you seem to be assuming that it's HHLL before and after the shock.
That's correct.
But is there any, I mean, when you go through the details of the model, is there any compelling reason to assume that that should be the case?
Well, I could give you a bad answer and a slightly better answer. The bad answer is if it's a small enough shock, it's not gonna flip us from one kind of equilibrium to the other. I mean, these types of equilibria exist for ranges of parameter values, and therefore, it's not sort of knife edge that we end up with one or the other. We're going to stay for a while with the same one. In fact, it's differences. If the differences between the industries are strong enough, then there is a compelling reason in the technologies that will tell us that one of these is more efficient than the other, and that's why we're seeing it. But I can't guarantee it for you. It's a good question. Okay, some technical terms on this slide. So I'm going to assume now, as I said before, that this productivity function has complementarities, that the good managers are especially productive if they're paired together with the good workers. Or in terms of the mathematical terminology, I'm going to assume that this function is strictly log supermodular. That alone already suffices from previous results in the microtheory literature that we know to tell us that there will be, these letters stand for positive assortative matching within each industry. That is to say, if we look at only industry 1, the best workers will work with the best managers in that industry. Doesn't tell us yet anything looking across the industries, but within each industry, we will see the best workers working together with the best managers. And you'll see that reflected in the figures that I'm going to show you. Now remember those sorting conditions that I showed you before. The elasticity of the wage schedule should be equal to the ratio of the elasticity of productivity with respect to ability divided by the elasticity with respect to numbers. This is true for workers. And then for managers, something similar. The elasticity of the salary schedule should be equal to the ratio of the elasticity with respect to ability divided by the elasticity with respect to numbers. The problem that makes this problem difficult, the feature that makes this problem difficult, is that how productive the workers are depends upon how good the managers are. So the good workers want to go to the industry that has a high ratio here. But when they get there, what happens if they find bad managers? Maybe they turn out not to be so productive as they thought they would be, and then they may be sorry. And similarly, the decision for the managers about which industry to go to will depend upon which workers they expect to end up being teamed with once they get there. To put that differently, the decision of what industry a worker wants to work with depends upon what managers are going to be in the industry they choose, and therefore the decision that the managers make. And the decision of the manager's industry to go to depends upon what decision the workers make. So these two sets of decisions are very much interdependent. So we have some results which tell us when it will be, despite this complication, if you will, despite this subtlety, when it will nonetheless be the case where we get a threshold equilibrium with the good workers going to one industry and the bad workers going to the other. So let me just spend a couple of minutes explaining what you see here. So this says, remember this ratio is what the workers are looking at to decide which industry to go to. And they're looking at their own ability and the ability of the manager they will be paired with. But that's not what you see here. What you see here is, this is the worst manager in the economy. So QH min is the minimum ability worker manager in the economy. So if the worker is tempted to go to industry I rather than industry J, even if he gets the worst manager here as compared to the best manager there, then he doesn't care where the managers go. Because independent of how good the manager he ends up working with, he's going to prefer to be here than to be here. And similarly for the managers, if the managers prefer to go to an industry I prime, even if they're teamed with the worst workers, and that's better than getting the best workers over here, then the managers are going to want to go to industry I prime. So if both of those inequalities hold, what is this a statement about? This is a statement about the technology. So coming back to the earlier question, this is a statement that says that ability is especially important in I than in J, so much so that it doesn't really matter which managers they end up with. They still prefer to go to I than in J. You know, the good scientists want to go to the rocket science industry and not to textiles, even if it doesn't matter who they're going to end up being teamwork with there. If that's the case, we're going to get a sorting equilibrium, either again with the best types going to the same place or with the best types going to the opposite places. Let's skip this proposition, and I'll skip that and that. and move here. Okay, so now I want to finally show you what happens to these teams when we have a trade reform. And the trade reform is going to change prices in the market. In particular, what it's going to do is lower the price of imports and raise the relative price of exports. So I'm going to raise the price of the export good and show you what happens to these production teams. And what we see on this picture is the initial teams that formed before the trade reform on the solid lines. Okay, and you can see that I'm illustrating the less empirically relevant case, the HLLH. So what is it showing? It's showing that all the best managers are going to industry I up to this cutoff point. That's the threshold. And all the worst managers are going to industry J before the trade reform. That's these guys here. And because it's HLLH, where all the best managers are going, happens to also be the same industry that's getting all the worst workers, namely these guys here. And industry J is getting all the best workers, namely these guys here. And within each industry, I said there was positive assortative matching, namely the better managers in the industry are getting the better workers. So you can see here we have this very good manager is getting the best worker that's in industry I. He's not getting the best worker in the economy because that guy is going to the other industry, but he is getting the best worker in industry I. And this guy here is getting these workers here, and so on. So these are the combinations that are formed in industry I, and these are the combinations that are formed in industry J. Okay, and now comes the first punchline. So we're going to change the price now. We're going to make export industry more attractive. Needless to say, that's going to make the industry expand. The price goes up. It's going to attract more resources. It's going to attract more workers, and it's going to attract more managers. So we're increasing the price of I. These were the managers that were there before, and now it needs more of them. So where is it going to get them from? Well, it's going to get them from here. And these are the workers that it had, the industry had, these are the workers that the industry had before, and now it needs more of them, so it's going to attract more workers here. So industry I is going to expand by attracting more managers who are not as good as the ones that were there before, because they already have the best. And it's going to attract workers that are better than the ones that it had before, because it had the lower tier to begin with. The only way it can expand is to go slightly up the ladder to higher quality workers. Okay, so now this new set of managers has to team together with this new set of workers. So we have to get from this manager paired up to this last worker. And the new matches are going to be like this. So I'll preempt the question, can it go like this? Nope, it cannot cross more than once. It only took us 6 months to prove that, but now it's proven. And so what's the conclusion? The conclusion is that subsequent to the trade reform, every worker is going to end up with a lower ability manager than he had before. And every manager is going to end up with a higher ability worker than they had before in this industry. But what's happening over here? Well, this sector is shrinking. That's the import competing sector. It's shrinking by shedding its least able workers. And it's shrinking here by shedding its most able managers. So at the end of the day, the teams that form in this industry are given by this instead of this. And you can see in this industry as well, all the workers end up with worse managers than before, and all the managers end up with better workers than before. Now, every worker likes to have a good manager, and every manager likes to have a good worker. So these recombinations are disappointing, if you will, for the workers, everything else equal, and encouraging for the managers. There are other effects going on that I'll talk about. But before I get to that, this has an important implication for income distribution. Why? Because there's complementarities between workers and managers, between their abilities. When we resort them so that each worker gets a worse manager than they had before, that's by itself bad for all of them, but especially so for the top end. So that's going to lower the relative income of the top end of workers in Industry 1 relative to the bottom end, and it's going to increase the relative income of the top managers. Okay, in other words, the income distribution as a result of this trade liberalization is going to spread for workers and narrow for managers. And similarly, in fact, for Industry 2. So this shows, sticking some numbers into the model, what happens if we, for particular numbers of all those parameters and for particular production function, what happens when we increase the price 5% of the export good. And you can see in this example that let me it'll help if I skip ahead. I'll come back in a second. Let's talk about this slide first, and then I'll backtrack. So overall, trade has 3 effects on the income distribution, 2 of which are familiar to those who have studied trade before, and 1 of which is the new effect here. So that's what is outlined here. First of all, for the different types of workers, some of them are sorting to the export industry, and some of them are sorting to the import competing industry. Why? Well, it's not whimsical. It's because the ones who sort to the export industry have a comparative advantage working in the export industry. What gives them a comparative advantage? Well, it's their type, their ability level. An increase in the price, an increase in the opportunities export industries will advantage those who sort to the export industry relative to those who sort to the import competing industry. I'll just say for those of you who have studied trade models, this is an effect known in the literature as Ricardo-Wiener effect, or sometimes a specific factors effect. That's a model where factors can't move between industries. My different types of labor can move between the industries, but to a certain extent they don't want to, because they've chosen their industry based where their skill level is most appropriate. The next guy who has to move to the industry is not as good in that industry as the last guy was, otherwise he would have been there from the beginning. So an increase in the price of the export good is going to advantage those types of workers that have ability that made them want to be in the export industry at the expense of those who wanted to be in the import competing industry. So that's effect 1, but as I say, that's a cross-industry effect that's familiar from the literature. Effect number 2, also familiar from the literature, is that trade liberalization is going to change the distribution between workers and managers. That's in fact what the Stolper-Samuelson theorem that I started out with from 75 years ago was exactly about. The industry that relies on managers, more importantly, is going to be the one, if that price goes up, that's going to benefit the managers throughout the economy relative to the workers. The new effect is that, and those 2 effects are still going to be here. You're going to see them in the figures I'm going to show you in a second. The new effect is this within occupation industry effect as a result of this rematching that I showed you. If you get a better manager, if all the workers in industry get a better manager than before, that's going to advantage the top-end workers relative to the bottom-end workers. Okay, so now let me flip back. So here's a case where I've made the Stoper-Samuelson forces very weak. Or in other words, I've made the two industries relatively equally reliant on workers relative to managers. Okay, so of those three effects that I showed you, the between occupation effect has been neutralized by assuming that the two industries rely equally on workers and managers, or equally intensive on workers and managers. So we see two things in this figure. These are the workers in the export industry, and these are the workers in the import industry, and these are the workers who changed industry as a result of the trade liberalization. And what I said is that trade liberalization should advantage workers in the export industry relative to workers in the import industry. So you can see these guys are gaining more than these guys. In fact, these guys are gaining 6% compared to a 5% price increase, so their income is going up in real terms. These guys down here are actually below zero, so they're in the import competing industry. They're subject to more competition from imports. They have talents that make them appropriate for the import competing industry, that make them less appropriate for moving here, where the firms want to hire lots of workers, not good workers, and therefore they actually lose from the trade liberalization in this example. And the new feature is the within industry. So you can see that among the red guys, it's the lowest ability workers that gain the most, and the highest ability workers that gain the least. Why? Because everybody's manager is downgrading. And these guys are hurt more by that than these guys. At the end of the day, they all end up in the plus column, but these guys don't do as well because they suffer more from the downgrade of their managers. So we see here, within industry, income distribution, in this case getting better, with the lowest paid workers doing the best, and that's true throughout the economy. Okay, we're almost there. Just hang in there for 2 more minutes. Well, we said actually that that wasn't the case we really wanted to look at, that the economy was probably in a case where the best managers sort to the same industry as the best workers. So that's what you see here. Here's the best managers in Industry 1, and they're together with the best workers. I'm sorry, not Industry 1, Industry J. And the worst managers are together with the worst workers. And here is the initial teams that form. Within Industry I, better managers get better workers, and similarly in the other industry. And now we liberalize trade, and what's going to happen? More resources are going to move into the export industry. That means more managers and more workers are going to move in. So this margin is going to move up, and this margin is going to move up. Much as we had before, where this margin moved down and this margin moved up. Now, in this case, in fact, both margins move up. So what can we conclude about the teams that form in the two industries? Well, you can see that there are 3 different lines there labeled B1, B2, B3. So with more resources in the industry, we have to move to a point that's above and to the right of this point here, because we're getting more workers and more managers. This is a point that's above and to the right. This is a point that's above and to the right. This is a point that's above and to the right. They're different. In this case, all the matches for the workers get better. In this case, all the matches for the workers get worse. And in this case, the matches of one industry get better and the matches of the other industry get worse. So the predictions about the effects of trade on the income distribution are going to be more subtle, and they're going to depend upon the features of the equilibrium that we could measure empirically, but that's not something we've done yet. So we can tell more story or draw more pictures like the one I showed you before. So here, just to take one example, is a case where, again, the low ability workers gain relative to the high ability workers. But in this case, in each industry, it's the relatively better guys that are doing better because they're upgrading their managers, and so the income distribution within industries is getting worse, but across industries is getting better. Okay, that's a subtlety. When people have measured links between trade and income inequality, they haven't controlled for industry typically. What this analysis is telling us is that the effects looking across industries can go in the opposite direction as the effects looking within industries. Okay, so again, just to leave you with the highlight or the punchline, by thinking about the heterogeneity of workers and managers or between any factors in the economy, we introduce a new effect of trade on the income distribution. It's going to be the case that different types of workers, depending upon their comparative advantage, will benefit or lose from trade liberalization, depending upon where their skills are most useful. It's also the case that workers will gain relative to managers if the export industry is labor intensive compared to the import competing industry, as is typical in a developing economy. But on top of that, what the new work has told us is that we have to look at how the teams reform within each industry. If you upgrade, if the workers manage to upgrade their managers in an industry, that's going to benefit the most able workers in an industry relative to the least able and generate a change in within industry income distribution if they downgrade. The opposite is the case, and let me call it a day there. Thank you very much.
I did not mention in the beginning of the presentation, but this seminar is very important for us, not only because we have a very, very special guest, but also because it's a joint seminar from EPGE and Ibre. I thank Regis Bonelli, who is here also on behalf of Ibre, who has helped us very much, and on behalf of Luis Shimura. And we hope to continue this series with more seminars for the students and for the faculty as well. And I would also like to thank, which I did not do before, World Bank and EPGE for contributing with this session. I also hope that in the future the joint seminars which are going to be conducted by EPGE and Ibre also have the support of the EPGE and of World Bank. So we are going to have as discussant of the paper Samuel Pessoa, who also does not need any presentation. He has been very active as an applied economist, is a researcher of Ibre, and is Samuel forever also a professor of our EPGE, who has advised so many students during his career with us, and now is at Ibre and EPGE. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Rubens, for the invitation. I prepared a small comment, and I'm going to read because I don't feel very comfortable in commenting such a deep, complex paper in my very bad English. Well, let's start. Not going to take more than 10 minutes, I hope. Well, I start to say that I came from a generation of economists that have been learning economic growth and international trade through Grossman and Helpman papers and books for more than 20 years, I think. Maybe not more than 30 years, but definitely more than 20 years. Then I am very happy and delighted to have the opportunity to present some comments and remarks on a new output of one of the most fruitful and long authorship of our profession. I can say that, I think, probably. Additionally, I think this is a paper that we are in desperate need of. I make this observation not as a researcher, what I used to be in the past and now I have already retired from, but as a consumer of economic knowledge. The paper applies a quite novel formal structure to international trade. It was quite difficult for me to understand the model and develop some intuition with respect to it. And I am not confident that I did it. But as soon as I got some understanding of it, at last I think I did, I began to use it as a glass to look at many economic phenomena around us. In this short comment, I will share with Professor Grossman and with you some issues that I think my view of his model can illuminate. The paper builds a framework that allows us to think on the interaction of international trade and income distribution, and maybe on the functional distribution of income. The theory is a variant of the traditional Heck-Cherolin 2x2 model. There are two production factors, managerial effort and labor, and two goods. On the top of a Heck-Cherolin model, they consider a heterogeneity of factors. They consider a production function in which one manager supervises an endogenous quantity of workers, and both the manager and the workers have different levels of productivity. Both quality margins interact in such a way that we can have a complementarity among the quality of workers and the quality of managers, or we can have substitutability among them. As the paper of Jean Eckhout and Philip Kircher, is a 2012 paper, showed, it has been published, Professor? Not yet. It's possible to have a very, this is very funny, I find very interesting these results. Usually it's possible to have a very qualified manager leading a huge team of non-qualified workers in a Walmart company, for example. Or we can have a qualified manager leading in a very small team of very qualified workers in a consulting company. In one case, we have substitutability among quality margins, and the other case, we have complementarity. As Professor Grossman showed us, the relevant empirical case for the Brazilian economy is complementarity. Based on microdata for the Brazilian economy and the Sweden economy, they consider the case of complementarity. Usually in traded sector, there is a positive correlation among cross-sector managers and worker remuneration. There is positive assortative matching, PAM. Given endowment workers and managers along with a distribution of qualities for each occupation, and giving a relative price for the two final goods, it's possible to derive a production equilibrium. The equilibrium is given by a set of quality of managers and workers, those two sets, and the quantity of managerial and labor effort corresponding to the quality of sets assigned to one sector, and the complementarity quality of sets assigned to the other sector. Completing the equilibrium, there is a scale of wages, a wage profile for labor, for workers, and a scale of salary for managers. These scales, these profiles, are increasing and continuous in quality. In particular, given that workers and managers can move from one sector to the other sector, the wages and salaries profile are continuous when we change from the set of quality assigned to one sector to the set of quality assigned to the other sector. Given that in equilibrium, this model produces a wage and a salary profile, wages for workers and salary for managers. It took me some time to learn that in the paper. And it's possible to do comparative statistics exercise on income inequality. The final part of the paper is a long and complex derivation of Stolper-Samuelson theorem for this production equilibrium. I missed a section with the derivation of revisiting theorem. I wonder if you did that. But really the question in the paper is really a Stolper-Samuelson question. What is the impact on the equilibrium of a change in the relative price of the final goods? For me, the most innovative feature of the model is the characterization of the impact of an alteration in the relative price which happens after opening the economy to international trade, on the wage and salary profiles. It is change in wage and salary profiles that allow us to talk about within occupation increase inequality, or within occupation decreasing on inequality. A typical pattern is the increase on income inequality for workers and a decrease on inequality for managers, and vice versa. Additionally, the increase or decrease on inequality has a between sector and a within sector component. However, it seems to me that the most interesting application was on between occupation and within occupation changes on inequality. Well, armed with this model, we have a nice glass to look at increase or not on inequalities as a global phenomenon. Probably one of the most interesting use for this structure model, is to understand the pattern and the dynamics of income distribution in the global economy in the last 40 years. The stabilized fact that we know is that income inequality within countries has been increasing. The income inequality in the US, for example, has increased, and the income inequality in China has increased. But the inequality in a composition of those two countries has been declining actually in the last 40 years. The stabilized fact that we know is that income inequality, that means that if we consider that the US and China as two independent economies, inequality in the last decade has been increasing. However, if we consider the economy that results from the union of both societies, inequality has been declining. Additionally, we know that the increase on inequality in the US in the last 3 or 4 decades was due to an increase on managerial inequality at the very top of income distribution. With respect to workers, probably there was a reduction on inequality in the US. Conversely, it is likely that the increase on inequality in China is mainly due to an increase on work inequality, and maybe managerial pay inequality has been declining in China in the last decades, probably due to an increase in lower quality manager pay. It's known that a sizable portion of the huge increase on inequality in China that has taken place, especially in the last 20 years, is due to an increase on the return on education. Maybe education inequality is more related to work inequality than managerial inequality. Probably that model can shed light on another important long-run change on a key economic statistics for the US. It's well documented that in the last 2.5 decades, the labor share of income has been declining steadily against the older view popularized by Caldor of a long-run stability of the labor share of income. Evidently, in order to employ this model to this issue, it's necessary to consider an augmented version of the model that includes physical capital on the top of the two kinds of labor occupation, worker and manager. A very careful recent description of the reasons behind the reduction on labor share of income, a paper in the issue of the fall 2013 of the Brookings paper on economic activities showed that globalization is a key factor behind this process. That analysis identifies offshoring of the labor-intensive component of the US supply chain as a leading potential explanation of the decline in the US labor share over the past 25 years. Based on this stabilized fact, we can think of an extension of the model in which globalization is not only international trade, but additionally, globalization is the possibility that a manager in a country supervises workers in another country, and vice versa. Then I wonder how it works this model in this situation, if it can maybe explain the reduction in income share and labor share of income in the US in the last 25 years. It seems to me that this route should be a very fruitful one because it can help us to understand the huge increase on CEO's pay that has taken place, especially in the US in the last decades. We know that changing on taxation, particularly some tax breaks at the top of the income distribution, can do some job explaining this phenomenon, but we are far from having a good understanding of it. The phenomenon, there's huge increase in CEO's pay in the United States in the last 40 years. Recently, the controversial French economist Thomas Piketty and his colleagues have raised the hypothesis that the huge increase on CEO's pay in the last decades was due to their capability in manipulating the board of shareholders. They have claimed that alteration on social norms that now accept high inequality as normal set the room for such manipulation. The problem with this explanation that CEOs pay from non-incorporated sector has increased even more. It seems to me that we are away from having a reasonable understanding of CEOs' very high pay. Maybe and hopefully that formal structure of the paper just presented can help us solve this problem. Those are my comments. I thank the organizing for having given me the privilege to comment on Professor Grossman's talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samuel. We are going to have these comments posted in the website of the workshop a bit later, so anyone who wants to go over that will have this possibility. So this is the good time of the seminar when we open to the floor, which makes a lot of difference because nowadays we have web discussions and so on, but the possibility of making questions is something that we do have now and you don't have in other ways of communication. So please feel free to pose questions, not only those related to the paper, but we have here with us today one of the leading economists in international trade, so any practical questions as well are welcome.
Being from the industry, I think your study is very, very interesting. But the data set is basically, as you said, from Brazil, right?
This one is yes.
Yes. And I was just thinking now, we had NAFTA with all the problems, and now we have the European and the US trade discussions and the contracts for next year maybe. Looking at your model, how do you see this outcome could be? With these two giants like the European community and the US will make these trade contracts. Who is going to win? Because in your case, who is exporting, in a good shape, probably he has more money afterwards, right?
Yes.
And who is importing, it's lowering. But now you have the two giants, Europe and the US. How do you see this?
Well, the so-called new trade theory, which is not new anymore, but dates back to Krugman's seminal work in the early 1980s, was exactly aimed at the puzzle that trade theory until then was about countries that are different from each other trading to compensate those differences. And I think if we want to understand the US trading with Mexico or China, that's exactly the right model. Mexico and China have a lot of unskilled workers. The US has a lot of skilled workers and relatively more capital. Opening of that trade with China, coming back to the earlier point, contributes to the less skilled in the US suffering relative to the higher skilled, and contributes to the income distribution trends that we've seen in the US and vice versa in China. Now, your question, what about trade with Europe? Well, what Krugman pointed out is we need really a different explanation for trade between countries that are so similar in terms of their technologies and factor endowments. And he developed a theory based on increasing returns to scale that both the US and Europe could benefit from having larger firms that took advantage of larger world markets. And in that context, the distributional effects of trade are more subtle, but again tend to benefit the more productive firms in each of the countries relative to the less productive, and by implication the workers that work for them. So I think we can see that we can predict that the Googles and Microsofts and high-tech firms in the U.S. that have been successful, and the top-notch manufacturing firms in Germany, BMW, and what have you, as at least the predictions of that model are going to be the ones that gain the most from further liberalization of trade, because they'll be the ones best place to take advantage of a larger world market. Another comment, if I might, and it's directed at you. I mean, one thing that we're working about Piketty's facts for the top, we think that globalization has a lot to do with it. In a world with increasing returns to scale, which is not in today's paper, it's beneficial to be big, and the benefits goes to those who are large. If we enlarge the world's market through globalization, the benefits from that are going to go to the ones that are most productive. So I think we can begin to understand the benefits for, you know, Zuckerberg and Bill Gates and so on. They were going to be rich even if the U.S. didn't trade, but they are especially rich because they can sell their iPhones and what have you, not only in the U.S. market, but throughout a world market. So I think increasing returns to scale tells us that the top end are really going to benefit from trade liberalization.
Well, since you mentioned the increase in returns of scale, I would like to pose a question, which I thought I would not be able to do because it doesn't fit into the paper. I remember in 1989, between 1989 and 1994 in Canada, not Mexico, Canada, that people were arguing, saying that because the integration with the United States would amplify the markets seen by the Canadian entrepreneurs, that would be a good idea because they would probably have increasing returns to scale, and by having larger markets they would have lower costs of production, and that would benefit Canadian firms very much. However, actually the same thing happened in 1990 when the two Germanys integrated. I mean, the people in East Germany and people in West Germany as well, they argued that increasing returns to scale would lead to lower costs of production and gains to both sides. However, what we saw is that the story is a bit complicated because after the integration, the amount of increase in returns of scale in average that we have measured in Canada was not that one that one forecasted. So what happened was a three-phase procedure. First, there were the winners, those who actually happened to amplify their production and decrease their costs. Those were the big winners. But then there was a selection procedure by means of which some firms happened to stay in the market and other firms had to leave the market. And why does this happen? Because the total consumption is given. So what is true for one firm is not necessarily true for the whole. And the whole could not everybody together increase production. So there was a very important scale in that some firms had to leave the market. And afterwards there was a third phase, which was the specialization. So those who did not manage to compete internationally and did not leave the markets only chose a certain niche to operate in that niche. Why do I tell this story? Because right now in Brazil, we are facing globalization, right? So what happens, for instance, with the executive education industry? We are subject to a real-time translation from Portuguese to English and English to Portuguese to Russian, everything. So those the industry in emerging countries are going to face, the executive education industry is going to face something very close to a fall of barriers, to a decrease in tariffs, because it's going to be very easy to teach in English and translate automatically to Portuguese. So what do we have to think? Well, we should be thinking about having increasing returns to scale and trying to compete internationally. But at the same time, there is this fear that we have to that we are going to have a selection procedure, and some firms may take the whole market, and some other firms may lose because they did not manage to show this increase in returns. And if you look at Canada against the United States and West Germany against East Germany, East Germany against West Germany, and Canada against the United States, you'd say that by opening frontiers to this executive education from abroad, we'll have to make a lot of effort to compete with them. So if you could comment on that.
I'm not going to discuss Brazil, but let me discuss the earlier cases. Yeah, I think your description was very accurate. I think what international trade theory tells us, when we open to trade with increasing returns to scale, there are two effects, and you described them perfectly. One is a market size effect. You can sell to a larger world market. That's good news. That means you can make more profits. But you also have to compete with more competitors out there. That's the bad news. That's going to cut into your profits. And at the end of the day, like with all forms of international trade, it's rarely the case that everyone gains or everyone loses. There are winners and losers. And the winners and losers, exactly as you described, or as Mark Mellitz described in his work, benefits those that are most productive. So I think the most efficient Canadian firms and the most efficient East German firms benefited from the opportunity to sell in the U.S. and in West Germany, respectively. The less efficient became domestic firms, smaller and without exporting, and the least efficient of them had to leave the market. And there were winners and losers. Now, I'll blame the politics. With a better political system in all these countries, and I presume in Brazil, there are ways, in most cases, to compensate the losers with the gains that go to the winners. The unfortunate truth is that happens too infrequently, and there are those who suffer. And the income distribution facts about the U.S. That Piketty have documented really show that the gains over the last 20 years have been very concentrated in 1% of the population, which is a problem. It's a problem that we're going to have to confront politically and economically.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Marcus Lehman, graduate of IBAPI here at FGV in Georgetown. My question is more related to intellectual capital, how intellectual capital can rise the tide of all boats, perhaps not on physical property exportation, but on intellectual capital exportation, how this might, and elaborating also on executive education, but economies, developed economies such as the Scandinavian economies, more developing or concentrated on the intellectual capital development and utilizing that as an export commodity, does that not also, instead of reducing or diminishing the gains of the importation partner, does that not also rise the tide, rise the benefit of the importation partners?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think that at least in the U.S. context, which I know best, the best answer to what the income distribution trends that we see, given the very high returns to schooling, is to make sure that there's opportunities for schooling that are very widespread, and the returns to schooling are especially high in today's economy. Knowledge is especially well remunerated, and so that the Scandinavian policy of making education readily available to all classes in the society is I think, the first line of attack against the trends in income distribution that we've been seeing. And also in the developing countries, in India and China, a lot of the growth, if you decompose the growth, a lot of it has been due to the increase in human capital, or intellectual capital, as you called it. So basically, I would agree, yes.
Professor, I'd like to ask you if you solve the Nijinsky-Terman in your model, because I think that China, you can think of China as just the sudden increase in the worker endowment of the economy. How it solved this problem?
Yes, so we did in the first draft of the paper, we had a section on exactly what determines who exports what in this kind of an economy. But journal referees being what they are these days, they wanted the paper to have more focus, and so it didn't survive into the latest draft. But we could talk about that. I have results on that. Yes.
Since you've studied the NAFTA agreement, I'd like to ask you about the immigration aspect of the trading.
About the which?
Immigration.
Okay.
We all know that with the NAFTA agreement, the U.S. has admitted lots of immigrants from Canada and Mexico to the economy. And I'd like to ask you if you think that Brazil has the strength to make a trading agreement as strong as NAFTA, and if the unemployment rates would
Increase or decrease?
Yeah.
Increase or decrease?
Yeah, decrease I lost the word. The efficiency of the economy. Brazilian economy.
Are you from EPGE? Sorry, excuse me, EPGE.
Well, the U.S.-Mexico immigration story is not quite as happy a story as you made it out to be. I wish that the NAFTA agreement had made good rules about immigration and, in fact, had encouraged immigration. In fact, as you probably know, most of the Mexican immigration in the U.S. Is undocumented, what we might call illegal immigration. My personal political view is that these people have contributed tremendously to our economy, that they're doing jobs that American workers weren't doing at all or weren't doing well, and I only wish that we encourage more of it. But that's not my government's position these days, unfortunately. Immigration is a very difficult issue because people have such strong feelings about it. My economic assessment is almost always immigration is beneficial to the country that has the immigrants. I don't know enough about Brazil to comment on it, but I know a lot about the Israeli economy. Israel welcomed over 1 million Russians in a 10-year period in a country that had only 5 million workers at the time. So that's a huge 20% increase in the labor force, and it really kicked off a growth boom in Israel. I think the migration between East and West Germany, similar. It does mean accepting in people that have different backgrounds, speak a different language, sometimes have different religion, and people find that difficult for whatever reasons. But from an economic point of view, I see immigration as largely a win-win. It's good for the immigrants, and it's good for the countries that welcome them. You get talented people. One of the reasons why immigration is so beneficial, and I think it's also true for Mexican immigrants into the U.S., is you ask yourself, who are the ones that immigrate? They're the ones that are most ambitious. They want the most for their families. They want to get ahead. You really skim off the cream of the labor pool that you're importing from. So I don't know who would come to Brazil. Which country's workers, but I could predict that whichever ones do would be the best of those workers and the most ambitious of those workers. So likely beneficial, in fact. There's not a lot of evidence that immigration causes increase in unemployment. There are a few papers that show that, but by and large, we find that immigrants can be absorbed, not massively in a short period of time, but over a medium period of time.
I remember when Eric Maskin was here with us, he was with us twice, and one of these times he presented a paper about globalization, not international trade, but globalization and income inequality. And he started by saying that Hector-Lin model, not this one, but the canonical one, did lead to a improvement of income inequality in poor countries, because poor countries would start by exporting increasing exports when globalization shows up, and by Stopper Samuelson, the low skill factor of production would have a higher remuneration, so that would decrease inequality. And then he told us a story, which I'd like to have your comments on that. He told us a completely different story that had to do with, for instance, the example of call centers in India. People chosen in India due to globalization, who would be answering, who would be surveilling, or who would be answering questions from people in the United States. And before globalization, those people who worked in the call centers in India would be those who would be matching, who would be pairing with lower skilled workers in India. So these people in the call centers, at least they could speak English well to communicate to the US citizens who would buy their services. But after globalization, with them starting to work in call centers, so actually they chose the managers from the advanced economy. So they started to match, they started to pair with managers, maybe Class B managers or Class A managers, but of the advanced economy. And because of that, the lower class in India, who was matching with these call center people, all of a sudden was isolated. And because of that, their relative remuneration decreased. And this is a way to explain, contrary to the Hector-Lin, why globalization, not international trade, but why globalization would foster income inequality, would increase income inequality. I don't know if we have been exposed to the Maskin's idea. How do you see that?
I think actually that's a great story for me. I will use it in the future. I mean, that's exactly the type of things that our model is trying to capture, is this the top end of the Indian, or not the very top end, but in this case the more able are being drawn into the export sector, leaving those teams with the less able having less skilled managers and having a negative effect there. So I think that's exactly right. It's interesting the contrast with China. So China's exports are very much based on its low-skilled workers, and I think what we've seen in the data is trade dragging up the lowest end of the Chinese income distribution, working for export sectors. India didn't export based on its huge numbers of low-skilled workers. It instead developed these niches in the service sector to outsource for American firms. It's a very different type of trade with different distributional implications.
Yeah. More questions? We have time for one or two questions yet. It's not working.
And some authors, as you know, are saying that the issue of global value chain changed everything about the theory of international trade, that you have to have new concepts and things like that. So I would like to have some comments. What you think about the issue of global value chain is so important, as people are saying, if it really changed the mainstream of international trade theory.
Yeah, I agree with that. I had a paper in the American Economic Review with one of my Princeton colleagues on exactly this issue. I mean, I think trade in the past was always about trading one type of good for another type of good. So it was about getting goods from where they were produced to where they were consumed. With global value chains, with fragmentation, with the breakup of the production process, we're now producing goods partly in one country and partly in another. If you look at the iPhone has value added from 15 different countries. The Boeing Airbus has value added from over 100 different countries. And so the nature of trade is very much changing. In our paper, we showed an optimistic story that this allows for better specialization in the production process, that a country that has a lot of unskilled labor, say China, in the old days, they couldn't make an iPhone. They didn't have the skills necessary to make an iPhone. But now they can do just a part of the production process, specialize. They don't have to be good at the whole production of the good. They can be good at a little piece of it. And so the efficiency gains from trade can be that much greater in a world where production can be fragmented. It does mean that the American workers now have to compete with those Chinese workers for a piece of the production chain, and again, that brings us back to the distributional implications. But from an efficiency point of view, I think the gains from trade for the world are going to be that much larger when we can have fragmentation of the production process.
We have time for one more question. Graduate students at the end of the auditorium. No more questions? Just a last comment. Once when I was in Chicago, I was researching about inflation and income inequality, which inflation very much increases income inequality. And I remember that Robert Lucas came by and he said, "Why are you concerned with income inequality?" And that and that made me think for a while. He was assuming, of course, that I should be concerned with Pareto improvements, which would lead to a possible redistribution of income. But what I want to say is that it looks like we do not believe in this possibility as being something to be taken very seriously. Okay. Okay, so thank you, all of you. I'd like to thank once more Regis Bonelli from Ibre, our co-partner, and I hope we start with new seminars. The foundation is now starting to materialize very much. Ibre and EPGE, and I am devising. We are going to have a huge seminar with the law school. I was making the preparation with Joaquim Falcão about the security problem in Brazil. Not only physical security, but let's say property rights, the right to go and come free and not to have violence, the right not to be surprised by taxes and so on. So we're going to have a huge seminar with the law school. And also another one with the BAPI, which is going to be by September, about education, about how do you foster education. So this is a way that to put forces together so that our students get to have the best from the international experience and from our internal capabilities of making teams like we are doing right now. I'd also like to thank the EPGE and the World Bank for one says that les penseurs il est nerf de la guerre. So our sponsors. I'd like to thank Samuel, who came from São Paulo especially for this session, and I know that he is very busy. I'm very grateful that he has written these comments so that we can post the comments in our website, on the website of the workshop. And also thank Professor Gene Grossman for bringing his experience for so many years teaching. So it's not only the ideas of the paper which count, but it's mostly the fact that he is here with us. He's sharing his time with us, and this is absolutely important. It is a part of a academic ritual that characterize our profession. So thank you all, and I'm sorry I cannot invite you for a cocktail because we have already had it, but thank you very much.